Good afternoon, and welcome to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series held here at the Museum of Nebraska History in downtown Lincoln, the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule for this lecture series is available on our website at www.nebraskahistory.org, and I would encourage you to go to that website and look not only for a listing of our Brown Bag series, but all of the other programming that the Historical Society does. You'll find, I think, something to interest pretty much everybody. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. Their financial support allows us to film these lectures, and then they are seen on local cable Channel 5. So we're very grateful for their support to allow us to get this programming out to many, many people around the city and, in fact, around the state. Today's speaker is John Schleicher. John has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Social Science, Science in Education from Hastings College. He has also a Master of Arts in History from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Currently, he's an assistant professor and head of special collections at the McGugin Library of Medicine at the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha. He also is serving as an adjunct professor in history at the Department of History, University of Nebraska, Omaha. John was on staff here at the Historical Society for a number of years, so we know him well, and he did a lot of work reaching out to the museums around the state when he was on staff here. His brown bag topic today is Robert Ramsay Livingston, Nebraska pioneer physician. Please join me in welcoming John Schleicher.
Thanks, Ann. It's good to be back here again today. I'm used to be the person who organized these lecture series. It's kind of fun to come back and do one. So thank you for the people in the audience for being here. It's such a nice day. Everybody must be outside today, so maybe we'll catch it on TV when it's on Channel 5. I want to give you a little bit of background about my talk today. I've been at the Med Center not quite 6 years now, and since I have come there, I sort of put two and two together because I grew up in Plattsmouth and realized in my archives at the Med Center in special collections I am in charge of rare books and archives, and we have some artifacts and artwork as well, some of which is medical related, some of which is not, interestingly enough. Some of it's just to decorate the library. But it's under my care. And we have artifacts, old instruments, microscopes, things of that sort. But as our director of the library reminds me constantly, remember, John, we're not a museum, we're a library. So if it's smaller than a bread box, we might consider taking it as an artifact. So, but I was able to find in doing some research on the background, because we're both the institutional archives of UNMC. We collect information on all of our colleges and schools and departments of the campus itself, but we also collect generally in the history of the health professions in the state, in all areas of the health professions, not just medicine, but nursing, dentistry, pharmacy, all of those areas. And in reading up on the history of the campus itself, when I arrived there, I realized, and as we'll see today, that what is currently today our UNMC, or University of Nebraska Medical Center, with the various colleges of medicine, pharmacy, nursing, public health, dentistry, and the School of Allied Health Professions grew out of a number of private institutions that were usually doctor-owned or dentist-owned, including the Omaha Medical College, which was started in 1881 in Omaha. It was doctor-owned, and I came to find that one of the physicians from my own town, historically Plattsmouth, Dr. Livingston, or we'll call him, sometimes he's called Colonel Livingston, sometimes he's called General Livingston, was one of those 6 organizers, the original founders of the Omaha Medical College, which in 1902 affiliated with the university and became the University of Nebraska College of Medicine. Of course, 1968 is when UNO joins the system, so we get that separate campus designation of UNMC, UNL, UNO, and now UNK, of course. So, as we like to say, semi-autonomous campuses within the same system is the official pronunciation of that. And I became very interested in Dr. Livingston because, not only because he was from my hometown, but because he did a lot of things. All 6 founders of the institution, as we'll see today, of the medical school, were all frontier town promoter types in Omaha. They all did other kinds of entrepreneurial things as well. They all did lots of civic things. Several of them were Civil War veterans as well. But when we think about the 19th century, we usually think of this Dr. Livingston, who has an E on the end of his name. This is not the Dr. Livingston that I'm going to be talking about, but of course the British Dr. Livingston who got lost in Africa, right? Found by Henry Stanley, the journalist and explorer, had an E on the end of his name. But in this case, our Dr. Livingston, Robert Ramsay Livingston, originally from Canada, born in Montreal, 1827. His father, he was British. His father was a British military officer serving in Canada. He had been injured quite severely in the War of 1812. He survived until not too long after his son, Robert Ramsay, was born. His father passed away as a result of injuries years later from his activity in the War of 1812 on the British side, of course. But Ramsay is born in Montreal. He goes to grammar school in Montreal. He eventually gets to medical school at McGill, what was then McGill College, now McGill University in Montreal. This is a historical picture of the campus, McGill College, about the 1860s. One of the things I was reading on their website was the buildings, the big building sort of on the right-hand side there with the 2 wings. The wings were being added at about the time we think that Dr. Livingston would have been going to school there. 1849 is when he received his medical degree from there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. So kind of a contemporary picture of this here. Livingston goes off after medical school. His bios say that he took some extra lectures, as was typical at the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York, which there were several institutions by that name at the time. He kind of wanders around back east a little bit. And talking about medical education of the day in the 19th century, we don't have really formalized medical education until really the turn of the 20th century. We have doctors sometimes paid to take lectures at different institutions. A number of the medical schools, like our Omaha Medical College, was a doctor-owned for-profit institution, so we don't have land-grant institutions like state colleges and universities like we have in Nebraska eventually having medical schools at this time. So he may have done some work in his work at McGill. We're not quite sure whether he actually got a degree from there, a diploma, but maybe took courses there, although he told about himself after he came out west that he did graduate or did go to school there, medical school there, and was degreed from that institution. Of course, out here in the west, in the middle part of the 19th century, we have a lot of people who claim to be doctors, a lot of quacks who maybe weren't really officially doctors. We didn't have licensing in Nebraska of physicians until 1902, so we had a lot of guys show up here who claimed to be physicians maybe, but weren't necessarily physicians. Livingston, among other things, had some business background. He managed to actually work with a copper mining company in Michigan for a time in the 1850s. They were headquartered in Boston, but their mines were up in Michigan. There was an economic panic in 1857, and he left that company at that time. The precious metals market dropped, and as far as we know, that's the point that he ended up sort of heading out west. He ends up in Plattsmouth in 1859 in Nebraska Territory. Great view, and if you've never seen the Andreas History of Nebraska, a great publication, which is actually the whole thing is online, so you can look at it there. Great illustrations. This one, I apologize, my copy of the file of this illustration of Plattsmouth is a little blurry, but we can see the river, of course, in the foreground, Plattsmouth from the Iowa side of the river, apparently. And looks like with the train tracks already there along the river, the Burlington, what is called High School Hill, the first school on that hill later on where I went to elementary school and middle school at the top of Main Street. So a view of maybe a little bit contemporary, a little bit later than 1859 of what Livingston would have seen when he arrived. We don't know for sure what lured him to Plattsmouth, maybe just a place in the west. We don't know if he knew anybody for sure there. or why he decided to stop there or settle there, not go, to California or further west somewhere. But he ends up in Plattsmouth in 1859. He establishes a medical practice there. He immediately gets very, very involved in the community, civic activities, social activities, the Episcopal Church, all kinds of things. He is serving temporarily. We don't know exactly, again, why. We don't have the facts that tell us why, but in April of 1861, he's serving as the temporary editor of the Platte Valley Herald in Plattsmouth, one of a number of newspapers that came and went in some of those early frontier towns. He receives word by telegram of the attack on Fort Sumter, April 12th, and the beginning of the Civil War. Again, another somewhat contemporary view a little bit later, maybe of the Guthman Block, downtown building in Plattsmouth, maybe a building that Livingston would have seen. When my family moved to Plattsmouth in 1966, we bought our house from Minnie Guthman, who's a descendant of this family, actually. So that's my reason for my illustration in there. Livingston immediately, before President Lincoln issues a call for troops, before Territorial Governor Saunders issues a call for volunteers from the Nebraska Territory, Livingston stops the presses, essentially, publishes posters, puts out posters, and puts out a call for volunteers to fight for the Union. Obviously, Nebraska, a very good, loyal Union territory in the Civil War. He eventually fills the roster enough that he organizes a whole company, or Company A of the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry. He is immediately elected their captain as the person who organizes them, and they were the first volunteers from Nebraska to go to the Civil War. Modern 1st Nebraska volunteers, the reenactors group, takes their name, of course, from this group, and we have a picture of them here at a reenactment at Gettysburg in 1998. From their website, actually. I stole that one. So, if you go to Plattsmouth today, and of course, since we're here at the State Historical Society, and you go to the Cass County Museum, which is on Main Street in Plattsmouth, you'll see one of the familiar blue historical markers that the State Historical Society puts up around the state, talking about this very event, Livingston's involvement in the organization of the 1st Nebraska. So this is the big blue markers we see on the roadside and all over the state. I'm not going to read all this to you because I'm going to talk about it in the rest of my presentation today, but the great thing about these also is the text of all of these is online at the Historical Society's website, so you can go and read all these markers and then maybe eventually go out and see some of the places that they talk about. Livingston serves, and to me as a layman, as someone who, when I came to UNMC, didn't have any necessarily medical background besides being a patient of doctors and nurses and dentists, found it interesting that in wartime, this guy didn't serve as a military officer. He served as a general officer. And I've had a couple of people who are students of the Civil War, and one of them who was a reenactor, who said probably because he was elected captain of his company that he organized right away, he went into the line or into the hierarchy of serving as a general officer instead of a medical officer. To me, I would think you'd need every doctor you could possibly get in wartime. And I know that he did, actually by practically firsthand accounts, that he did do medical things while he was in the war if he was needed. But he served as a general officer, so he was commanding regiments, groups of soldiers, and districts, as we'll see eventually, located at specific places. So he rose fairly quickly through the ranks. December 1861 is promoted to major. June of 1862, promoted to lieutenant colonel. The fall of 1862 to colonel. He and the 1st Nebraska Volunteers are at some pretty major battle sites: Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and Shiloh in Tennessee, Corinth in Mississippi. In the summer of 1863, he becomes the commander at St. Louis, of course in the border state of Missouri. And in the fall of 1863, he's made commander of a little bigger area referred to as the District of St. Louis. He also eventually serves in Arkansas, of course, one of the Confederate states. He is made head of the Department of Arkansas. He is later, after the war, thanked by a joint resolution of the House and Senate of the Arkansas legislature for his service there. Obviously, probably seen as a very fair occupier, dealt well with the people, etc., for receiving that resolution of thanks from their state legislature. 1863, another interesting thing to me as not a military person necessarily, a military history person, we have the 1st Nebraska comes back home on furlough. They re-enlist as veterans, but they're converted from an infantry to a cavalry unit, cavalry regiment. They're sent out, 1864, out to western Nebraska. I like all the historical sources that say western Nebraska, to Fort Kearney, of course, which we know is central Nebraska, not really western Nebraska. For my family is originally from Scottsbluff, so Kearney is not western Nebraska. The spring of 1865, he gets promoted to the temporary or brevet rank of brevet brigadier general and is mustered out in July of 1865. He is acknowledged highly for his service as in the Civil War. He's one of the leading names that you see in the histories. Again, the Andreas History of Nebraska, 1882, names, the big names like Thayer, who later becomes governor, others who fought in the war, but Colonel Livingston, or General Livingston, sometimes he's referred to as, Dr. Livingston is one of those big honored officers, high officers from the Civil War service of Nebraska folks, people from the Nebraska Territory. This is from a great memorial to him upon his death in 1888. And it's just, I'll read it to you quickly here. As an officer, General Livingston was marked for his executive ability, his courage, his manly soldierly bearing, and his peculiar adaptability for military affairs. He was a strict disciplinarian, yet he retained to a singular degree the respect and goodwill of those under his command. He was kind and indulgent to his men, but he exacted from everyone as soldiers, service, and discipline. So nice memorial for him upon his death for his Civil War service. He immediately returns to Plattsmouth after the war, goes back to his medical practice, and becomes very, very involved, as I said, in the civic life of the town, the social life of the town, the business life of the town, as we'll see as well. Really a town promoter kind of type of person, as we see so many places in our early towns, especially out here in the Nebraska Territory before we become a state. He's one of the founding members of the Plattsmouth Board of Health, 1866. Basically what the city council did was say to all, I think there were 3 or 4 doctors in the town at the time, all of you are going to be the Board of Health. So they didn't upset anybody by not asking them to be part of it. They all became the Board of Health. 1869 to 71, he's appointed through Senator Thayer at that time, former Civil War comrade, through his influence by President Grant as the Surveyor General for the United States, for the federal government, for Nebraska. The office had been moved from Nebraska City to Plattsmouth, office of the Surveyor General. Another gentleman had held that post, and then Livingston succeeded him from 1869 to 1871. He goes into local politics, serves as mayor of Plattsmouth from 1873 to 1876. 1879, he's a founding member, and I love this name, of the Nebraska State Board of Fish Commissioners, which is one of the, as you can imagine, one of the predecessor agencies of the Game and Parks Commission of today. He also ran for Congress several times, and we'll talk a little bit more about his political party affiliations in a moment, but he started out as a Republican but eventually became a Democrat, and we'll talk about why later on. But Andreas, the history of Nebraska that Andreas does, has a great quote about him that I have here. Colonel Livingston was nominated for Congress on the Democratic ticket, but the political preponderance was too great the other way. Well, some of us in Nebraska know that's still true today, so us Democrats, I should say. As I said, he gets involved in civic and social kinds of things in town. As the doctors, of course, even to this day, are kind of seen as some of our leading citizens, especially at this time, maybe most educated people in the 19th century. He's an early member. I don't find his name among the very first founding members of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, but early on a member and leader, officer of the congregation, the vestry of the church, as it's called. Many, many Masonic Lodge activities, master of the Plattsmouth Masonic Lodge, Grand High Priest of the Royal Arch Masons, eminent commander of Mount Zion Commandery, and, as you would imagine, at the bottom there, when the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization, is organized in Plattsmouth, post number 45, in 1880, he's the first commander, or president, essentially, of that chapter of the GAR. He also becomes involved as really an early settler, and Plattsmouth, of course, is founded in 1854, as soon as people can come over into the territory, just like Omaha, Nebraska City, all those other river towns. He's a real town promoter and gets involved business-wise. As a physician, obviously he wants a population so he can have patients he couldn't always make a living necessarily as a frontier doctor, so sometimes you had to get involved in other pursuits as well if people were paying you in chickens and eggs and things, and you didn't have cash on hand necessarily. So he's very influential in bringing the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad to cross the river, the Missouri River at Plattsmouth. He's appointed as the chief surgeon of the Burlington and Missouri, or was part of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, of course. He's mentioned in 1868 in the newspaper as an officer of a railroad we probably never heard of before, the Plattsmouth and Pacific Railroad, which never came to be. But the city of Plattsmouth had issued bonds, had issued funding for the Burlington to come through Plattsmouth, and also Livingston and the city fathers come up with this idea that, as the Nebraska Herald describes here, the idea of building a short line railroad to connect Plattsmouth and the Burlington with the Union Pacific in Sarpy County was first suggested by General Livingston, and so far as we know, every important move in the matter has either been suggested by him or received his hearty cooperation, the paper says in 1868. Also, there was envisioning of this line going north-south up to Sarpy County, but also maybe going down to Nebraska City eventually as well, but it never actually materialized, never came to fruition. Livingston, again, as many of our town fathers and local politicians are, involved in the battle for statehood, or the move from territory to statehood. April 1866, he's an alternate delegate to the Territorial Convention. Great quote from the Nebraska Herald, May 1866. We learn that the speaking at Rock Bluffs, which is I'll say Plattsmouth suburb today, the Cass County Historical Society has a little school there as a historic site today. Speaking at Rock Bluffs last night was well attended and considered a considerable degree of enthusiasm manifested in the cause of state. So again, we're moving from Nebraska territory to Nebraska statehood. Livingston is a strong proponent of statehood, and ironically, for those of us citizens of Nebraska today who deal with taxes, our high taxes, he thinks that statehood will be a benefit to lowering taxes, and he writes in 1866, this is all taken verbatim from the newspaper, the Nebraska Herald, May 2nd, 1866. Facts for the people, I'll read it to you here. The growth and prosperity of Nebraska, the figures. We're permitted to publish the following correspondence between General Livingston and Mr. Gillespie, Territorial Auditor. The figures give an encouraging view of our condition. My dear John Gillespie, that is, I want you to send to me over your official signature a statement of the taxable property under territorial government in each county in Nebraska and the taxes on the same in detail. My desire is to present unanswerable and incontrovertible arguments to the people and show conclusively that it is every man's business in Nebraska to advocate and vote for state government. Do all you can and as speedily as practicable to help me to these figures. The people are intelligent and will understand such arguments infinitely better than passionate oratory or Billingsgate. So he believes that if we become a state, our taxes will get lower. Well, that's a laugh line, you guys. It's not true. Is it? It's not true in 2008 anyway. And who knows Billingsgate? Anybody ever seen that? Billingsgate was actually a fish market in London, but it was sort of blather, not very nice conversation maybe between the fishmongers and their customers, or just, it's sort of political speak, maybe we think of it as stuff that is just blown up arguments and maybe rude and crude and just boulder dash, maybe is another word we could use for it, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Just the politicians maybe arguing their case more to an extent that we don't want to hear about, maybe. So Billingsgate, that was a new word I learned when I saw that in the newspaper as well. Back to Livingston's politics again for a minute. As I said, he was originally a Republican. In 1872, he supported Horace Greeley, of course, who was nominated by both the liberal Republicans and the Democrats to run against Grant in his second term, running for president. He was the radical Republicans, of course, of Reconstruction, post-Civil War. And after this time, then Livingston afterward affiliated with the Democratic Party. But another great quote here from 1898, when General Livingston's son was killed in the Spanish-American War and memorialized. The Evening News reported or told a little bit of history about the family and says, later General L. was honored by his fellow citizens in Nebraska with political preferment, and his services were in constant demand by the political party with which he had allied his fortunes. This party was the Democratic, and in the days when to be a Democrat was to be almost an alien in the land, General L. reared his sons in the faith and party of Jefferson and Jackson. So again, not many Democrats after the Civil War in Nebraska. We take a turn and look at General or Dr. Livingston's long and distinguished medical career. Almost as soon as he returns home from the war, we get him founding and organizing and serving as the first president of the Cass County Medical Society. 1868, he's one of the founders of and an officer of the Nebraska State Medical Association, which of course is still around today. 1880, a founder and one of the faculty members of the Nebraska School of Medicine Preparatory, which is a predecessor just for 1 year to the Omaha Medical College. 1881, again, as I mentioned earlier, he's one of the founders and first president of the faculty, they were called, or essentially what would be our dean of the College of Medicine today of the Omaha Medical College. The Omaha doctors thought since 1869 they had actually had a charter to start a medical school, but they didn't know if that would be successful at that early time. And so finally in 1880 they decided, well, we'll do a 1-year prep school, and our students can take some lectures and they can go back to Chicago or to Pennsylvania or wherever, to New York, to one of the more prestigious Eastern medical schools and finish out their degree there. They could just get a little head start at this prep school. Well, the prep school turned out to be so successful that they decided the next year, the next summer of 1881, that we would go ahead and do a full-fledged medical school. So we have the founding of the Omaha Medical College, as it was called, again, a private, doctor-owned proprietary school. There were 6 signatories to the original Articles of Association, June 14th, 1881. These gentlemen, 6 gentlemen here. You see a lot of doctors, especially maybe small-town doctors who are of this time, who maybe participated or came into Omaha as faculty. They called on, if you had a specialty, you kind of had to do it everywhere. So they didn't specialize as much, of course, as they do now, but a number of other gentlemen were early doctors, early faculty members, I should say, of this organization, of this college, but these are actually the 6 guys who signed the Articles of Incorporation or Article of Association. Drs. Kaufman, Denise, Gibbs, Livingston, of course, Mercer, which is a pretty familiar name, especially for Omaha folks, and more. And I just want to briefly take a look at these other 5 so you can see a little bit more about how they were so much alike. And I shouldn't say that I want to start maybe working on my PhD, and what I'm really interested in is these 6 guys as almost as people outside of being physicians. You know, what they were all so involved in other civic things, social activities, other entrepreneurial kinds of businesses, and they were all physicians, obviously, and 4 or 5 of them were Civil War veterans as well. So I kind of have in mind maybe someday a dissertation on these 6 gentlemen and how they, what they did outside of doctoring, not necessarily as physicians, but again, sort of contemporaries as far as the years that they lived, and I won't read through every one of these. Victor Kaufman, interestingly enough, the bottom point there, it's kind of fun to know that he's buried, dies in 1908, buried in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, of course, which is high on the hill at 50th and Leavenworth, today overlooking what became his college, the campus, the ever-expanding campus of the University of Nebraska Medical Center, which is actually creeping towards his grave every day because we're moving a little bit further west and a little bit further east at the same time. So his last resting place is overlooking the institution that he helped to found. Dr. Denise, again, these are all fairly contemporary gentlemen as far as when they lived. Most of them went, of course, to medical school back east somewhere. Several of them served in the Civil War. A number of them served as city physicians or county physicians sometimes, the Omaha City Physician or the Douglas County Hospital, Douglas County Physician. Denise actually goes out to Grand Island for a while, serves in the U.S. Government Land Office, so again, something outside of the medical practice, his medical career, and comes back to Omaha eventually, and he's appointed as physician to the Nebraska Deaf and Dumb Institute in Omaha. Wellington S. Gibbs, again, another contemporary, 1947 to 26. He, a little further west, went to the University of Iowa, came out in 1880 to Omaha, is professor of anatomy. A number of them have either railroad surgeon appointments and or life insurance kinds of appointments as physicians. So, of course, with his Iowa connections, I assume he's the medical examiner for home life of Burlington, Iowa. And he, interestingly enough, is also among the founders of the University of Omaha, which, of course, later becomes the UNO, what we know as UNO today, celebrating its centennial this year. Samuel David Mercer, again, a name a lot of you probably know, lived until 1907. He pretty much almost wholesale stops being a physician and becomes a real estate developer in Omaha. He came out in 1866. Like Livingston was chief surgeon of the Burlington, Mercer is chief surgeon of the UP Railroad. He builds the Mercer Mansion at 40th and Cumming, which is still there, is on the National Register of Historic Places. And interestingly enough, in the real estate department is the ancestor of Sam and Mark Mercer, who are the developers of the old market in Omaha. A number of those buildings the family owned for a long time. Mercer, as another sideline, had the Mercer Chemical Company, which was located at 12th and Howard in what is today the old market. Of course, he sold, and his son operated it, he sold all kinds of medicines, elixirs, their ad says syrups, wines, I guess medicinal wines, all kinds of preparations, either lozenges or sugar tablets. They have this great ad in 1900 of all their different concoctions that they sold to physicians, medications and things of that sort. Richard Channing Moore, again, fairly contemporary, 1841 or 1916, went to school in Chicago, came out in 1865, was president of the Omaha Pathological Society, was president of the State Medical Society. A number of these guys take turns being president of the State Medical Association or Society. They change their name a little bit from time to time. He was chairman of department at the Omaha Medical College, was the city physician. And I'm not sure the Board of Examining Surgeons for Pensions, I assume that maybe was a federal-related thing that he did as well. The Nebraska College of Medicine is founded, as we said, in 1880, exists for 1 year, basically, because it was so successful, it gets turned into a regular medical school. It was located here in the Hillman Block at 13th and Farnham Streets. Classrooms, lectures on the 3rd floor of this building in rented space, so they didn't have time to be so successful that they built their own building. We get the first class of the Nebraska School of Medicine Preparatory. We have our big 6 here, alphabetically Kaufman, Gibbs down here, Denise over here, our own Livingston in the center, Mercer, and Moore. We have some other faculty members who taught various things. Interestingly enough, in this class of graduates, 2 women and 1 African-American gentleman down here. So quite a variety, even at that early date, of medical students. We probably have, maybe even a little bit more, 51 or 2%, I think, of our newest class this fall are women at the University of Nebraska College of Medicine. Omaha Medical College starts out, becomes successful, builds their own building at 11th and Mason Streets. It's located adjacent to the St. Joseph Hospital, which was the major hospital at that time. Of course, what we know now has become today essentially Creighton University Medical Center, the old St. Joe's. This building is eventually picked up and moved physically to 12th and Pacific. If you're familiar with where the main post office is in Omaha, it was on that corner where the post office is today. Moved in 1886. Dr. William Milroy on the front porch there, who was one of our only physicians from Nebraska to have a disease named after him, Milroy's disease. We have the first few of some of the graduates here of 1882 of Omaha Medical College, or OMC as I'll refer to it for brevity here. 4 of the 8 doctors who graduated with the first class. At the same time we have this going on in Omaha, we have the University of Nebraska, of course, here in Lincoln, tries to start a medical school, or they call it a medical department of their own. from 1883 to 1887. It was located in University Hall here on the city campus. Livingston also taught on the faculty of this department. I assume he probably jumped on the Burlington train and came from Plattsmouth to Lincoln to do his lectures maybe once a week, or I don't know for sure what the commute was like then, but this medical department of what we know as UNL today ended up being unsuccessful. There were not the number of, just the population for one thing, of Lincoln versus Omaha. There weren't the number of patients to study in clinical setting and clinical teaching. There weren't the number of hospitals and institutions to do clinical teaching in Lincoln that there were in Omaha. There were other issues about this medical department. There were stories about, I think Jim McKee's written articles on this, the anatomy professor's carriage outside of Wyuka Cemetery late at night, so we're maybe gathering cadavers. So finally the Board of Regents said, no, we're not going to try this anymore. We just don't have the we don't have the foundation for this yet as this new land grant school to have a medical school. So this is ended in 1887 by the Board of Regents. In the meantime, the opposite is happening in Omaha. Omaha Medical College is growing. They replaced their frame building with a new stone building in 1893. As you can see here, students posed both in the windows in front of the building on the left side, on a wagon, a stagecoach or something on the right side with their banner that says OMMC. Some of them are actually holding banners and pennants and flags, and some of them are actually holding bones. So one of our faculty, who's kind of our historian at the Med Center before I got there too, Dr. Bob Wingert, Bob Wigton says maybe they were on a pub crawl. We don't know exactly what they were doing here on the stagecoach or wagon that they're sitting on. So we get the successful success and growth of Omaha Medical College. Here is an addition to the building in 1889, still at that 12th and Pacific location. We had a football team for several years. Here's our 1900 football team. And maybe this year with Bo here it'll get better, but you see the first time I did this lecture was last fall, so I put at the bottom even better than the Cornhuskers maybe. We have the interior shot here of the building at 12th and Pacific, Dr. August Jonas giving a lecture in 1894 in the amphitheater. Again, we see several women scattered throughout here. The Omaha Medical College, a privately owned institution, starts to have some financial difficulties. There was always the goal by the University of Nebraska to maybe start these kinds of professional schools, especially by the turn of the 20th century. We start to see some courses in pharmacy. We don't necessarily have a college of pharmacy yet. We have the Lincoln Dental College, which is a private institution that eventually affiliates with the university and becomes the dental college. Same thing here. Eventually, we get the Omaha Medical College affiliating with, or essentially being taken over by, the University of Nebraska in 1902. We celebrated in 2002 our centennial of that affiliation, but we also celebrated in 2006 the 125th anniversary of the original founding, 1881, of the College of Medicine as the Omaha Medical College. There's all kinds of griping back and forth about this, especially when they went to buy land for the medical college in Omaha. The legislator said, you know, the university charter doesn't give the university any right to have any part of it outside of Lincoln. Everything has to be in Lincoln, right? This is government city, so everything is here. The Board of Regents has no authority to have a college or any other part of the university outside of the town. Obviously part of the still Omaha-Lincoln rivalry that we see. But we get the establishment of eventually get over that. We get the first 2 years of medical school are down here in Lincoln, your basic science years on the city campus here. The second 2 years, the clinical years, are up in Omaha. Finally, by 1909, we get this debate played out in the legislature. We get land purchased in southwest Omaha at 42nd and Dewey to be the medical college campus, and our first building, now called Pointer Hall, built there in 1913. Eventually, because of a national report that's done on medical schools, the Flexner report in 1910, 1912, he recommends, he says, why is there this split system? Why do you take your first few years in Lincoln and then you go up to Omaha to the medical campus to finish? So in 1914, all of the courses get moved, all of the years of medical school get moved to the Omaha campus. Back to Dr. Livingston. He of course, establishes his family. He marries a woman by the name of Anna Beardsley, has 4 sons and 2 daughters, Robert Ramsay Jr., Theodore Philip, John Stewart, the 4th son, Henry Guy, who we don't have a picture of here, the one who was killed in the Spanish-American War, and then 2 daughters. I've seen them as Annie or Anna and Janet or Jeanette, so we're not quite sure exactly of their spellings of their names. The doctors Livingston, we have 3 out of 4 sons following in their father's footsteps, going to medical school. The black sheep, the odd duck, becomes a lawyer. But I figure with 4 doctors in the family, you might need a lawyer for malpractice and stuff like that. So Henry Guy is the one who goes to the University of Michigan Law School, becomes a lawyer, practices in Plattsmouth for a number of years, goes off to the Spanish-American War and is killed in 1899 in service in the Spanish-American War. The other sons, TP is actually the oldest, Theodore Philip. He practices all his medical career in Plattsmouth. His next youngest brother, Robert Ramsay Jr., he has practiced at Cedar Creek for a while. He went out and worked at the state asylum in Hastings, Ingleside. He eventually went down to South America for a time and did some, I think, missionary work there. He comes back, and from what I've been able to kind of tell, that maybe he caught some disease or something in South America when he was there that eventually kills him. He's not very old when he dies, only age 40 when he dies in 1906. Again, also the youngest son, John Stewart, or second to youngest son, I should say, John Stewart, practices with his brother Theodore, or TP, in Plattsmouth in their medical practice there. Livingston dies, and I've also found in my research since I've been at the Med Center, a lot of doctors die fairly young. It's like sort of like physician heal thyself. You know, why are you dying in your 50s or your 60s or your 70s, which we might consider even young, kind of young today in modern terms. Livingston is only 61, dies in 1888. He's out on a trip for the Plattsmouth Board of Health, a hygienic inspection of the city, and he must have been not very hygienic because he contracts cholera while he's out on this mission for the city. The Omaha Daily Herald, upon his death, his obituary notes, he was taken sick with a bad case of cholera morbus and was prostrated by a failure of the heart's action. The sad news of his death spread rapidly throughout the city, and all united in extending their heartfelt sympathies to the bereaved family. The office here, the illustration from the 1888 Plattsmouth Daily Journal, a special issue called R Illustrated, is pictures and illustrations of the town, located at 619 Main Street. The building is still there today. Interestingly enough, it's a dentist's office today. Oops. Hitting my extra mouse here. And we see here the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad in Nebraska Medical Department in memory of Dr. R.R. Livingston. And draped, of course, in the cloth, black cloth there upon his death. This is the office of Dr. Mosman, William Mosman, who's a dentist in Plattsmouth today. So we find, and I try to tell my students, I work with some first-year med students actually, and I work also teaching history at UNO part-time as an adjunct professor there. You know, history is not removed. I try to make connections for my students to history. I try to make it as real for them as I can. Why is something in the world that's happening today, how is that a result of history? How do we trace that history, just like we trace our family history and genealogy or whatever, back to in any area really, our school, our doctors, our profession, whatever it happens to be. In this case, we get what I like to call the clinical genealogy back to Dr. Livingston. His passes, as we said, his practice on to his sons T.P. and John Stewart. They work all of their careers in Plattsmouth. They eventually passed their practice on to the next generation, Dr. Raymond Westover, who passes away in 1967. He's an alum, of course, of our College of Medicine, as many of our physicians today are alumni across the state, of course, who subsequently passes the practice on to Dr. Richard F. Brendel, who's a World War II era alum, 1942, graduate of the College of Medicine. A picture of Dr. Brendel here, lived 1915 to 1985. In 1966, these cute kids moved to Plattsmouth with their parents. and they became patients of Dr. Brendel, siblings, 3 siblings, and their youngest little red-headed brother, who happens to be here talking to you today. My direct connection, Dr. Brendel was my doctor as a kid growing up in Plattsmouth, and I realized this, after doing all this research, like, here I am, I'm working at the institution that Livingston helps to found, and my physician as a little kid was the inheritor of the practice of this same doctor, essentially, over the years in Plattsmouth. So it's kind of an amazing thing that you can trace those direct connections back to people. It makes history for me much more real if we can kind of find those connections and those relevancies to each one of us and connect ourselves. It's easier, I think, probably in a small state like Nebraska, where we're a young state as well. We can connect back to those things historically. But I'll conclude there today. I would be happy to take questions, if I can, about Dr. Livingston specifically or about medical history in the state. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you. Any questions? Great. If not, then have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.
Having a 20-foot setback, these 2 lots, I'm their full lot to the west. Maximize, I having additional parking in the neighborhood. And to the extent that we can, I think that we ought to have as little impact.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there these 2?
Baker Engineering Service that was shown up here was roughly 3 hours. I'm going to a drafting tool and support the parking lot. At church, I have a son. We do not Public Works, and since I wrote quite a few of the points that we had, and with the approve the plan for works in trying to justify for. You've done it here twice. Let's go back and do it. Backing maneuvers from the 55-degree parking aisles, and very few stalls with other cars coming. Public Works aspect standards. So.
Mr. Baker, you oppose materials in the public right of way convinced by the by council?
I considerations that I measure allows for that foot stays on their own property. Triangles on a stop sign condition through there. So on there, and I'm not site plan condition is site triangles.
Those be the side triangles at the alley.
That 15-foot site penetration also allow you some site
Would solve the problem?
that
And at the
correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support or opposition?